Welcome to Khanversations. I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan, and today I'm going to talk to you about the persistence of terrorism in the subcontinent. There are a few questions that I want to address. I'm not going to offer a systematic theory of why this happens. These are just some thoughts that I want to share with you, hopefully to spark a conversation on the web and in the policy circles, in the academia, and also in the media. So basically, I'm going to throw a few thoughts at you about essentially two or three topics. Number one, as to why there is a persistence of terrorism in the subcontinent, in the Indian subcontinent, number one. Number two, for a long time, people who are experts of political violence in the United States and the West has been arguing that one of the reasons why there was terrorism in the Middle East, in particular, in the post 9/11 era, these theories popped up, is because of the absence of democracy, and therefore democracy was seen as an antidote to terrorism. However, that is not the case, and I will tell you why shortly. And the third point is what can be done? What can be done in order to combat terrorism? There is no place on earth, no region that is not affected by terrorism. The intensities may vary, but it is like you suppress it here, it pops up here, you suppress it here, it pops up elsewhere. And while there are some Islamophobes out there who try to say that it's violence of that kind is happening only in Muslim countries or by Muslim actors, but let me tell you that there are actors of all shades and colors who are using terrorism as an instrument. In fact, these days in America, the biggest threat comes from white nationalists, white extremists who are more or less Christians in America. One of the biggest terrorist attacks in New Zealand was done by a white nationalist who was Christian. So from that point of view, you could argue that even in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar, you see that there are even Buddhists who are involved in genocidal violence. And therefore, the question really arises is why has terrorism become a global phenomenon? And is our democracies really an antidote to terrorism? And finally, what can we do about it? So before I start sharing my thoughts, please do the needful. Make sure you subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon so that you get notifications. And those of you who watch regularly and enjoy Khanversations, find it thought-provoking and interesting, if you can, please join Khanversations. The button to join Khanversations is right next to the button to subscribe, and it'll be great if you do so. So this past 2 weeks have been fascinating well, I shouldn't say fascinating because they're tragic. They involve violence and death, but also from an intellectual perspective for those who study this phenomena, or at least talk about it or think about it, that in the last 1 month, we've seen various interesting things happening with regards to terrorism, especially in the context of the Indian subcontinent. One is this entire issue of India being accused of killing a separatist in Canada. And there's all this chatter going on social media that India is also responsible for killing Khalistani activists as well as Kashmiri militants and terrorists in Pakistan in the last few months. And then there is this chatter also that another aide of the mastermind of 26/11, a massive terrorist attack in India, Hafiz Saeed's, or one of the leaders of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, was killed just a couple of days ago in Pakistan. And there's a lot of social media chatter that perhaps India's intelligence agency RAW was behind this particular assassination, as also there is speculation that RAW was also behind, or at least somehow involved in the assassination or killing of Harpreet Singh Nijjar in Canada. Not only that, so this is a case of a democracy exercising extrajudicial execution, essentially indulging in extrajudicial executions across borders, and that too, in the case of Niger, in a potential partner and a close friends, which also happens to be a democracy, Canada. And then you have Canada. You must recognize that in the past, countries which have killed their enemies in other countries have been labeled as countries that sponsor terrorism. So the United States Department of Justice for many years has had labeled Iran as a terrorist sponsor of terrorism because that Iran was killing dissidents in the United States and and Europe, and that's how it began in the late 1980s. This idea that there are certain states which are indulging in terrorism. The T word has not been used in the Indian context, but India has used it by accusing another democracy of harboring terrorism, and this time it's Canada. So you suddenly see the second side of this. You see, there are accusations that a democracy is killing its dissidents, its enemies in other democracies. And then you have a scenario where a democracy, India, is accusing another democracy, Canada, of harboring terrorists. And to be fair, for decades, India has been complaining about the freedom with which Khalistani separatists operate inside Canada. Especially since the late 1980s. And Canada has not really moved in any way to curb terrorist activities, sponsorship of criminals, and essentially long distance violence. Or at least looked into it and presented a report in the parliament saying that India has asked us to look into it. We have looked into it, and this is what we found. And then besides that, you have the peculiar and unique and singular case of Pakistan, which has been accused of cross-border terrorism, not just by India, but also Afghanistan. And the United States and many European countries have also occasionally, frequently, and sometimes quite frequently accused Pakistan of assisting and facilitating cross-border terrorism. For a long time, Pakistan was on the FATF grey list. And now you find that the recent attacks, like the Anantnag attack in Kashmir very recently, is also attributed to cross-border terrorism facilitated by Pakistan. And then now Pakistan and Afghanistan too has accused Pakistan of facilitating terrorism across borders. And of course, the world has been worried about terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. And now Pakistan itself is a target. In fact, for several years, in fact, in this century, for most of the last 10, 15 years, Pakistan has perhaps been one of the biggest targets of terrorism by often the very organizations its own military is created. So Pakistani military, whose job is to provide security for Pakistan, has created the very well, I won't call them institutions, organizations, gangs, and terrorist groups that undermine its security. And this has been going on for a long time. And apparently the Pakistani army perhaps is the one most incapable of learning. I mean, the learning curve of the Pakistani army seems to be zero. It has not learned that the terrorist organization it creates, it cannot control them indefinitely. And so the skill sets that it provides them, the resources it provides them, the training that it provides them, the freedom that it provides them to operate are now all used against it. If it hadn't been for the tragedy of innocent people dying, one would be tempted to say they deserve it. I don't think anybody deserves to be a target of a terrorist organization because terrorists, by definition, kill innocent people. So you see all kinds of things happening now in the Indian subcontinent. There is violence in Bangladesh to some extent. And of course, there is excessive violence on the other end of the Indian subcontinent, which is Myanmar, where there's genocidal violence and violence against its own population by the army, generating more than 1 million refugees who are Rohingyas. Talking about definition of terrorism is also critical because some groups are not labeled as terrorists and some groups are labeled as terrorist organizations. I think basically when civilians, unauthorized people, if you're not in the military, you're not in the army, you're not in the police force, and you have no government authority to act in the interest of a country, and you're exercising violence, then that violence is illegal. In the modern nation-state system, the only people who are authorized to exercise violence legally are the nation-states. Their armies and the police and security forces, under certain circumstances, within constitutional limits, are allowed to exercise force. But if civilians are exercising force at their own will and behest, they are terrorists, especially if they're targeting civilians and innocent people. So even mobs that go around in the streets burning homes and killing people are terrorists, even if they're not labeled terrorists yet. Let me give you an example. Dylan Roof, a white extremist, walked into a church and killed 8 black worshippers there. He was targeting them because of their race. This is a clear act of terrorism. But because he's white and because he's American, he was not labeled a terrorist. They called him mass murderer and all kinds of things, but they did not label him terrorism. And so when you look at the data on terrorist activities in the United States, Dylan Roof and that massacre in the church does not show up. So when you're making policy about threats from Christian terrorists or white terrorists, this data is not included. And so it underestimates the threat from Christian white terrorists in the United States. In spite of that, today in America, it's a consensus that the biggest terrorist threat comes to the US, at least, is from white nationalism. And of course, the most spectacular display of this was on January 6th. Even though some American politicians do see that as a violent insurgency, they try to use the word as insurgency and not terrorism. And those people who have been charged, some of them have just been charged as vandals and not as terrorists. I bet you if on January 6th, a bunch of black and brown people had charged the White House or the Capitol, they would all have been labeled terrorists. Probably they would have been all massacred with that 16th at that very moment. So yes, so there is a bias in who's labeled as a terrorist and who's not labeled as a terrorist. So what it does is that it makes it difficult for policymakers to execute counterterrorism strategies. Laws that are made to counter terrorism are then selectively applied based on which episode is deemed as terrorism and which group is deemed as terrorist. So some groups continue to operate because the laws are not applied to them, even though they may be acting in ways which are clearly terroristic. In the same country, if some other group with a different religious, ethnic, or racial identity would do that same thing, that act would be labeled as terrorists. And there are valedictorians, people who come first in high school in their class, who have been labeled as terrorists for buying a ticket to go to Istanbul to join ISIS. They've done nothing. They've not killed anybody or anything. They just bought an airline ticket, which is proof that they were acting upon their desire to join ISIS, and they have been sent away to prison as terrorists, and they're charged as terrorists. Whereas Dylan Roof, for example, went in actually church and killed 8 people and was not charged as terrorists. There are many such examples of people crossing borders with the intent to kill, carrying guns, and then killing, and yet not being labeled as terrorists. So one of the reasons why I think terrorism persists is, even though post 9/11, most of the world became very alert to the dangers and threats of terrorism, and new instruments, legal and policy instruments, have been created, new techniques of fighting terrorism, new technology for surveillance, for predicting and anticipating terrorism, have all been generated, yet terrorism persists. And submit to you that it's primarily because it's not applied across the board in many ways. For those in India who are amazed that after the change in the Indian Constitution 370, the Article 370, after its abrogation, the violence in Kashmir went down. What people don't tell you that it's not because Kashmiris were so thrilled, oh my God, this is what we were fighting for since 1980s. The Kashmiri insurgency was not about removing Article 370 and its removal. It is because what it did was it made Kashmir a union territory and brought it directly under the control of the central authority. And so the laws and the rules and the protocols and the strategies of counterterrorism have been applied more seriously and more systematically than when Kashmir was a state. So the reason why the violence primarily has gone down in Kashmir is not because of the removal of Article 370, but because in actual practical terms, because Kashmir was made a union territory from a state. And in order to make it a union territory, you had to abrogate some of the specifications of Article 370. So that is because the new technologies and laws, etc., which were created to fight terrorism were being applied systematically. And I think because of this problem of definition, that of terrorism, that people can actually massacre people, kidnap women, rape them, strip them naked, march them through cities, take videos, etc., and it's not terrorism. And because you don't label it terrorism, you cannot use the laws, the techniques, and the technology that is available to you to go after these terrorists who terrorize those people. So it's the politics which is sabotaging the counterterrorism strategies and techniques. So one of the reasons why terrorism continues is because of definition problems, which are extremely political. The other thing that I think the reason why terrorism persists is because I wanted to make one more point about this definition issues. If you look at the recent terrorist attacks in Mastung in Balochistan, you have a very unusual situation. Even there, you see India as being accused of being behind the scenes. And at the time I'm recording this, no one has claimed, it's been nearly 48 hours, I think, since the terrorist attack happened, and no one has claimed responsibility or taken credit for that. But something unusual also happened. And of course, the Pakistani government has accused India of that. It's very funny. The Pakistani government said that it is India which is probably responsible for this. And then they talk about measures that they are taking which are against TTP and other groups. If it's India is responsible for this, then why aren't they taking measures against India? Why aren't they going to the international forum? Why aren't they going to FATF and presenting whatever evidence they have? So India right now has two cases of Canada and Pakistan accusing it of various activities with absolutely no proof being presented. But what has happened in the Balochistan case is TTP has come out and said, we didn't do this. Which is quite unusual for a terrorist organization. Often terrorist organizations are willing to take credit for somebody else's attacks. So there have been instances in Europe where both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have tried to take credit for terrorist activities, especially in France. So why did TTP say that it is not responsible for that? Because I think in the TTP's head, terrorism, as the definition is use of violence against civilians, political violence against civilians, targeting civilians with the objective of changing policies of governments, threatening governments, etc. But the key element is targeting of civilians is considered as terrorism. So TTP probably thinks that it is targeting the Pakistani military and security forces and not the civilians. So they don't see themselves as a terrorist organization. They see themselves as a rebellion or an insurgency. So TTP is saying, look, we didn't do this because this is clearly targeting of civilians who are not a threat to anybody. They are just celebrating the Prophet's, peace be upon him's birthday. So the reason why TTP, this is the way that the discourse of definition comes. TTP is trying to say that we are not terrorists, we are insurgents, we are not terrorists, we are rebels. And we are fighting for a political ideology or a political cause. So that's why it's interesting that there are these issues that happen because of the way we define terrorism and we talk about terrorism. Why does this thing persist still in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent? And what has this got to do with democracies? If Canada is nurturing terrorist organizations, and the Canada's case is very, very interesting. It's not only that there is a democracy in which terrorists seem to thrive. So it's like Afghanistan, which is one of the best democracies in the world. Remember, Canada is a better democracy on the democracy index than even the United States or India. So we have these three cases of Canada, a full democracy, India, a flawed democracy, and Pakistan, a hybrid country with elections. So apparently, this best of democracies has been nurturing and allowing terrorists to some of them are born there to thrive for decades. So this idea that democracy is an antidote to terrorism is a bit complicated because yes, these terrorists are not as yet anti-Canada, but to use Hillary Clinton's famous statement that she used in Pakistan, if you allow snakes to, I don't know what she said, if you breed snakes in your backyard, they will eventually bite you. And that's probably what's going to happen to Canada. But the Canada that allows that, it raises the question that democracies are not necessarily antidotes to terrorism. And something else is also interesting. In fact, Canada is using democracy as a cover to protect them and saying that these are essentially expressions of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of political participation. So some of the activities of the Khalistanis are being protected as democracy. So it's not just that they're thriving in democracy, but democracy is also a cover for their activities. So it really compromises this theory of democracy as an antidote to terrorism. And if India is indeed killing its opponents, if the Indian government is directly or indirectly, and there is no proof yet provided by Canada or Pakistan. So I want to premise my statement by that. So if India is responsible in that way, then India is also a democracy which is indulging in activities which are clearly violating international law. Yes, it can say it's in its national interest, but clearly it is against international law. And so you have another case of a democracy indulging in actions which have been labeled as terrorism in other cases. And then you have, of course, the Pakistani case. So this assumption that if countries became democratic, then terrorism will disappear. Add to that all the white nationalists in Europe, in Norway, and New Zealand, and the United States now indulging in terrorist activities. This theory that democracy is an antidote to terrorism, I think, is now fully debunked. And finally, I think the reason why terrorism persists in subcontinent is because of two reasons. One, because the border issues are not yet settled, and most of the terrorism in the Indian subcontinent are border related. So at some point, there has to be some kind of a massive region-wise attempt, like a major summit, a border summit, under the auspices of either the UN or G20 or SCO or SARC or some region. And India should take a lead on this and resolve all existing. I mean, they need to finalize the boundaries of the countries once and for all. And until that happens, there will be all these perceptions that I belong here, I belong there, or you belong to my territory, etc. And given what is happening in Manipur, I will not be surprised if there are intelligence analysts and thinkers in China who are suggesting that well, we should convert Arunachal into another Kashmir. And there you will see another attempts to arm insurgents and terrorists, etc. So the border issues need to be resolved. That's number one. And until then, I think terrorism will continue, and sadly and unfortunately, in the subcontinent. Number two, I think that the laws and the definitions have to be applied consistently, regardless of the religion, ethnicity, caste of those who are perpetrating terrorist activities. Do not use species and shady arguments to say, oh, this is not terrorism. This is just people are angry that something happened 300 years ago, something happened 400 years ago. So they are indulging in expression, freedom of expression of their anger and frustration towards other communities and indulging in violence. If that is allowed to thrive, it will also soon be acknowledged. The only reason why some Hindutva groups are not being labeled a terrorist organization is because of violence happening only in India and targeting only Indians. Once they start doing the same thing overseas, in Australia or even in Canada or somewhere else, it will immediately be labeled as terrorist organizations. So it's important for India itself, for Indian government, to apply the law and shut this nonsense of political violence exercised by civilians against other civilians should be zero or minimal, or there should be very serious consequences for those who do that and those who incite that and those who even suggest that it should be done or it's okay. And the third thing is the mixing religion and politics. For many years, I myself have been someone who believes that religion can be a force for good. Religion can be a force for good. Religious values can bring responsibility, can bring compassion, can be intolerance, can bring moral justification for welfareism, etc., in governance. But increasingly, I also see the dark side of religion and politics. Religion brings hatred of the other. Religion justifies violence against the other. Ordinary people who are one day working as ordinary people selling food or repairing bicycles or whatever, ordinary chap. And suddenly, for religious reasons, they are willing to go and kill other people because they feel that they have said something negative about their prophet. They're willing to kill and burn people because they think that they have eaten a particular kind of burger or beef, or they have sold a particular cattle. So this religion related violence, which empowers ordinary people to feel that they can take the law in their hand and go and kill and murder people, is another reason why, if this is not checked, it will continue. We have seen the dangers of this in both India as well as Pakistan. And needless to say, I think the government authorities have to come down really hard on this. Otherwise, it will continue to be, first of all, civilians shouldn't be killing other civilians, and there being no consequence to that. But it will contribute and exacerbate other kinds of ethnic, religious violence because it leads to accumulation of grievances. And once the list of grievances begins to pile up, then, and if the state is unwilling to take action, then you will have disastrous impacts. And we have seen small genocidal violence all over the world. So I think these are the three or four areas in which one is allowing religion in politics. Number two, also not settling border issues, I think, are the two primary reasons why there is persistence of terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. That's one thing that I think is important. The other thing is obviously is the integrity with which laws are implemented and applied across the board, regardless of who is responsible for political violence or incitement of political violence. One person is banished from parliament for insulting a caste, while another member of parliament will abuse another member of parliament and his entire religion and his group, but nothing happens. So once you start doing things like this, then you can see that there is unequal implementation of legal standards, etc. And that leads to grievances, and that leads to violence. While I recognize that this particular conversation is not very strong on policy recommendations. That was not my goal. I just wanted to share some thoughts because of those events that are going around with these countries: India, Canada, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan context. So I hope you found this conversation interesting, thought-provoking, makes you think, make you revisit some of your fundamental assumptions about identity, about politics, about how to protest, etc. And so please subscribe to Khanversations if you have not already done so. Like the video, press the bell icon. Don't forget to share it with your friends. And if you can, do join Khanversations. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Please take care of yourself. Take care. Bye.